There is a kingdom where shackles.
Well, hey, fancy meeting you here on the worldwide interweb thing. Hey, as you know, this is a coaching video for those of you who are going to be teaching on a Sunday morning in either a student or adult small group on November the 3rd. So if you're going to be teaching that morning, I'm here to help you make your way through your teaching transcript and make sense of it and kind of understand where it's leading. So get your teaching transcript in front of you, get something to write with. I'm going to walk you through it page by page, and hopefully this will make teaching your lesson just a little bit easier. So grab it and let's just move on right through it. All right, page 1 on your teaching transcripts, just an overview page. This is for you. This is a page that you don't teach, and it's introducing you to your lesson. You're going to see you're teaching out of a couple of different passages Sunday, and this lesson, as always, overlaps and dovetails with the sermon you're going to hear on Sunday. And the sermon you're going to hear Sunday is a little more of an interactive sermon. You're going to hear some sermon, but you're going to see a lot of stories of things that God is doing all over the world and some of the things that God has done through the ministry here at Dayspring. And this lesson builds on that by drawing from that sermon, which will really focus on John chapter 20, verse 21. We'll be wrapping up our series in John. And we're going to be looking at Jesus' words to his disciples there in John 21, or 20:21, where Jesus told the disciples, he says, "Just as I have been sent by the Father, now I'm sending you." So Jesus uses terms of mission, that he came on mission, a specific mission, and now he says, I'm sending you the same exact way. So we have a mission. It's a derived mission. It's not one that we define for ourselves. It's something that we are just doing what Jesus came to do, which has to do with seeking and saving that which is lost. And it has to do with every man, woman, and child having access to the gospel. So this lesson is all about that. And if you look at your primary point that you're teaching and trying to communicate in this lesson, look at your handout. It says Jesus sends out his disciples just as he was sent out. We often don't know, however, how this sending is supposed to look. So here's what this lesson's all about. We know that we've been sent. We know what the mission is. Our problem is sometimes we don't have a clear picture of what it looks like to be a sent person, okay? So that's what the lesson's all about, and you're going to start teaching it right there on page 2 in your transcript. So look at that with me. This is the introduction to your lesson. Pages 2 and 3 is your introduction, and here's how you're going to start this thing off. Number 1, first of all, if you're a 10:30 group, be sure to pay attention to the teaching tip. You know how you're going to start your lesson off. There's some specific stuff there that has to do with the specific sermon that you're going to hear Sunday. Because of some of the things that you're going to hear and some of the things that you're going to see that deviate from a typical sermon. So pay attention to your teaching tip if you're a 10:30 group. But for everybody, here's how you're really going to get some things going here. Look at the top question there where it says to ask this question. And here's the question you're going to ask to start your lesson. You're going to ask this question: what comes to mind when you think of the term missionary? I mean, what kind of face do you envision when you hear the word missionary? So you're going to let people talk about that, and maybe you have kind of a picture of a missionary in your mind. You know, those pictures may vary. It may be somebody like Mother Teresa. You know, when you hear missionary, maybe that's what you think of. Maybe it's someone that you've met or seen. Maybe somebody from the International Mission Board or someone like that. Maybe you've spent some time with a missionary in times past, but think about what that missionary looks like. And there's a little bit of an elaboration there that you can talk about on your teaching transcript. But after people talk about, well, here's kind of my image of a missionary and kind of what they need to be good at and the kind of lives they need to live and those sort of things, look at the statement in the middle of the page, because this is really the hook of the introduction. It says, what's most telling about our understanding of the term missionary is what does not come to mind when we hear the word. I mean, what we see, it's what we don't see that's really telling, because here's what we don't see. Look at it. Very rarely do we hear someone talk about missionaries and instantly picture ourselves. That's the hook here in the introduction. When we hear missionary, we think of a specific kind of person, namely someone who doesn't look like us. All right? But here's the thing, and look at the next paragraph. I'll just read that to you. It says, in the sermon today, we learned that, or we're going to learn that, we've all been sent on a mission by Jesus, and that's the very definition of a missionary. One who's been sent out by God, well, that is a missionary. And what we learn in the sermon is that we've all been sent. Just as Jesus was sent as a missionary, so to speak, on mission on this earth, just as he was sent, now we've been sent. So we are indeed missionaries, every last one of us who embrace the term disciple of Jesus. We are a missionary, and unfortunately, we don't think we fit the mold because we have a picture of a missionary in our mind, and it doesn't look like us. So this is really what the introduction is all about. As you look on page 3 of the introduction, it says, today we're going to look at 2 general ways that being sent fleshes out in our lives. In other words, when we say, okay, what does it look like to be a missionary? Well, there's a couple of good pictures of that. In this lesson, we're going to look at those 2 pictures, and we're going to look at it in the lives of 2 apostles, one named James, one named John, actually brothers. And the cool thing is that this James and John, we've studied them in this John series recently in your small groups. You've studied James and John because there was a lesson, if you remember, that you taught on what greatness looks like and what it means to be a great in the kingdom. And James and John, if you remember in that lesson, they didn't get it. They absolutely didn't get it. They were arguing about who was the greatest and all of this. And Jesus showed them what greatness looks like. And in that lesson that you taught, we saw at the end of their lives, James and John, they got it. They understood what greatness looked like. And here's the deal. They spent the rest of their lives on mission for Jesus and with Jesus. So when we look at the life of James and the life of John, what we're going to see is 2 pictures of what it looks like to be a sent person. But those pictures look very different. So we're going to look at them one at a time. All right, look at page 4 on your handout. Here's where we're going. You've got a 2-point lesson here, okay? The life of James and the life of John. All right, so here's the first one, page 4, the story of James. Being sent can mean giving your life for Jesus. That's point 1 of your outline. By looking at the story of James, we see that being sent out, what does it look like to be sent out? What does it look like to be a missionary? Well, one of the pictures is giving your life for Jesus. Now, this is going to bring you to Acts chapter 12. You're going to open it up. You've got a little background information. Then you're going to have somebody read verses 1 and 2. And basically, verses 1 and 2 just talk about how James gave his life for the gospel, how he was martyred for the faith. All right? And by the way, this lesson is going to draw a good bit on some church history, okay? Because the Bible verses that you're going to teach aren't going to explain a whole lot. For example, like the death of James, it's not going to tell you a lot of details. It's just going to tell you he was killed for the gospel's sake. But how did that happen? Well, we'll look into some church history to kind of get some background on these stories. And there's a great teaching tip for you. If you want to really delve into the details of some of the lives of some of these martyrs, there are some books that you can look at or some online articles that you can read, and there's a good recommendation on there if you really want to get some more background of some of this extra-biblical history. When I say extra-biblical, I just mean history outside of what the Bible details, okay? So we're going to be using some extra-biblical history. But you're going to start in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, reading about the death of James. Then from there, you're going to start talking about the details of how James died. And that's all spelled out for you right there on page 4 of your handout. But here's a great story. When it comes to the death of James, what you're going to see is that even in the moment of his death, he was doing the work of a missionary. Even in the moment of his death, he was exposing people to the gospel and bringing them to the gospel. So the whole point on all of this about the life of James is that sometimes when we say, what does it look like to be sent on mission for Jesus? Well, sometimes it looks like giving your life for the gospel. James shows us that. Move on to page 5 on your handout. It finishes up that section about James, which is the first point of your outline. What it looks like to be sent, well, maybe giving your life for Jesus. But here's the second picture. One picture is giving your life for Jesus, like James. Here's the second one. It's right there in the middle of page 5, the story of John. Sometimes being sent can mean living your life for Jesus. All right? So James shows us being sent might mean giving your life for Jesus. John shows us that being sent might mean living your life for Jesus. So let's explain what that means. First of all, you're going to read from Revelation chapter 1 on this, okay? Verses 9 through 11. And there's a great tidbit of information on page 5 that you need to read before you teach this part out of Revelation, okay? And it's kind of a funny tidbit, but it's one a lot of people I know need to look at, all right? But anyway, Revelation, here's what you're going to do. You're going to have everybody open up their Bibles to Revelation chapter 1, and you're going to explain that basically this is something that John wrote very, very late in life, okay? One of the last things he did is he writes this revelation from God that he has seen. Now, you're going to have him read verses 9 through 11. And those verses, you're going to read it and you're going to go, what does this have to do with the point that sometimes being sent means, living your life for Jesus? Well, you're making the point in a roundabout way, because here's the point that you're making. John explains, and in fact, just look at the last paragraph on page 5. This passage doesn't really tell us anything about John's death, but it does tell us something important, that John lived. In fact, John lived a very long life. He outlived all the other apostles by a significant amount of time. And it's not because he was less outspoken about his faith than the other disciples were, or that he lived less sent. Far from it. So here's the point. With James, we saw a life that burned out pretty quickly because of the gospel. John, we see a life that endured a long, long time also because of the gospel. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Look on page 6. This is again where we're going to turn to some extra biblical sources to learn a little bit more about how John died, or really how he didn't die. And on page 6, you're going to see there's a good bit of history about how church history tells us that they actually tried to kill John and couldn't. So the whole point of all of this with John is this. John's assignment as an ambassador of Christ, John's assignment as a missionary, his God-appointed assignment was to live a long time, to live for the gospel. James, they killed James for the gospel. Well, guess what? John, they tried to kill him but couldn't. So God had a plan for him to live a long time for the gospel. And again, just like James, he finished his last days doing the work of a missionary. So do you see the picture here? You've got James. What did it look like for him to be sent? Well, it meant giving his life. What about John? What did it look like for him to be sent? Well, it meant living out his life to the fullest extent. So you've got a good transition statement there in the very middle of page 6. If you look at it, you've got a great transition statement that gets you to this great illustration. And I'm not going to read the whole illustration to you there. It's on pages 6 and 7, but it's about a couple of missionaries, Jim Elliot and Bert Elliot. Now, you very likely know the story of Jim Elliot. If you don't, it's spelled out for you there on your transcript. As you read it, you're going to probably say, oh, yeah, I remember him. Well, a lot of us know about Jim Elliot because he was a missionary who gave his life for the gospel, and his life was cut short doing missionary work. But his brother, Bert, also a missionary, has lived a long life doing the work of a missionary. A long life. And there's some great quotes in there about, Bert described his brother Jim, and this is on page 7, by the way, of your transcript, right there in the middle. Bert said this about his brother Jim. Jim was a great meteor streaking through the sky. In other words, Jim burned up quickly for the gospel, made a big splash and burned up quickly. But there's a quote from somebody else about Bert Elliot. And you know how he's described? You'll look at it on there. As a faint star in the distance that faithfully rises night after night, always there, always faithful, always doing the same boring thing. Which simply means that Bert Elliot has served God faithfully day after day after day. So think about the parallel between the brothers James and John. James gave his life for the gospel. John lived his life for the gospel. Now look at these brothers. Jim Elliot gave his life for the gospel. His brother Bert living his life even to this day for the gospel. So there's this great illustration. And I'll tell you what I would do if I were you. Look at the teaching tip on page 7 for further study. If you really want to get into the story of Jim Elliot and those who died on the mission field with him, there's a great YouTube clip you can look at. It's a 5-minute clip that kind of highlights some things told from the vantage point of the son of one of the missionaries who died. I would watch that if I were you. It's really going to help you understand what happened there on that mission field. And it may be that you even want to use that clip as part of your teaching. You'll have to work the details out of how to make that happen. We have some TVs at the church, but not enough for every small group to use them. So if you want to use that clip and you know how to import YouTube videos and get all that, that would be a great thing to use. If you need some help on that, I'm sure somebody can help you figure all that out. But look at the bottom of page 7 where it says to say this. This is after you've made all the illustrations. You've talked about the Elliott brothers and all of that. It says, this world needs both. Talking about those who give their lives, those who live their lives. It says the world needs both. It needs to see great meteors streaking through the sky, blazing on fire for the Lord and willing to burn out at the blink of an eye. But it also needs to see the faint yet steady stars waking up each day to do the same faithful thing, always offering the steady light of Christ. For what mattered was not whether James or John or Jim or Bert chose one path or the other. What mattered was that they were willing to go wherever the Lord sent them and to spend their lives however the Lord desired their lives be spent. And the same goes for us today. So, boy, what a great lesson, huh? It's about the fact that just as Jesus was sent, now he sends us. We see what that looks like. It may look like the life of John. It may look like the life of James, which we've also seen personified in these other two brothers, Jim and Bert Elliott. So that's the lesson that you've taught. Now, after that, look at page 8. That's your application moment. I hope you know how to utilize this part of your study now in your lesson. Pretty much what you're doing at this point is putting a group handout in the hands of all your people, and you're going to let them work through that handout. Look at the handout itself. You see it on page 10. Flip on over to page 10 of your transcript. This is the handout that you're going to have in your folders that day. But the small group handout, basically, you've got 4 passages that your group's going to read, and preferably in smaller clusters. After each one, they're going to fill in a blank. And they've got 2 statements that they can fill in. Look at it. They can either fill in this statement. Living or giving my life for Jesus means blank. Or the second statement. I should live or give my life for Jesus because blank. So what your group will do, they'll read each passage one at a time. After each one, they'll just kind of talk out loud and fill in these blanks together. For example, look at the first one. I'll give you an example here. The first one, for 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, where Paul says, therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So in those clusters, here's how this would work. They would read that verse, and then they would say, okay, in light of that verse, let's fill in these blanks. And here's how it might work. Say that first blank there. Living or giving my life for Jesus means, well, how would you fill that out? The second one, I should live or give my life for Jesus because why? Well, based on that verse, well, because it matters, or because it lasts, all right? Now, that second passage, Romans 10, verses 13 through 15, that's the one that talks about everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But it says, how can they call on the one they haven't believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they've never heard? So after you read that passage, after those people in those clusters read that passage, think about how they might fill in this blank. Living or giving my life for Jesus means, well, it means, according to this passage, it means doing the most beautiful thing I can do. It's a beautiful thing to do that according to this passage. Or how about the second verse or blank to fill in based on Romans chapter 10? I should live or give my life for Jesus because people's eternities are at stake. There's a good reason to live or give my life for the gospel, right? So you give them this handout, you let them work through those 4, you let them talk about it for a while. After that, you can conclude the lesson. And your conclusion, of course, is found on page 9 on your teaching transcript. Man, you could just read that as it is. That's a great conclusion that you have there on page 10. Kind of brings it back to James and John, as well as the Elliott brothers who you used as an illustration. And then from there, you can finish your group time by memorizing this week's memory verse, John chapter 20, verse 21, which is really our theme verse for the day in the worship service as well. So that's your lesson. You know, that's your lesson. It's about being sent. It's about what it looks like to be sent. As the Father sent Jesus, now he has sent us. What does that look like? Well, a couple of good pictures we go through in this lesson, and we learn why and how we may be sent in the way that Jesus has designed for us to. Hey, I hope this has helped you as you look through your transcript. I'm sure you'll look it over many more times. Be sure to look up those stories on YouTube. I think it will inspire you and help you to teach the points with greater conviction. God bless you. Look forward to seeing you Sunday.